In this clip, we're going to discuss preparing the student for assessment. This is one of the most important parts of your job, and we'll discuss this further during the video. So if we have a look at what it says in the assessor guide, it says when preparing the student for assessment, you need to ensure the scope, the context and purpose of assessment are agreed on with the student. So you really need to explain what the assessment requires, which we'll talk about soon when we look at the learning management system. The student understands the training plan and any other relevant documents. So at the start of the course, the student will get a training plan that discusses the assessment task, but the most important part there is probably the assessment details and arrangements, which lists all the assessments and when they're due. The performance requirements are provided and explained to the student. So by performance requirements, we're talking about, okay, to successfully achieve the assessment tasks, these are the things that the assessor is going to be looking at. Any legal, safety or ethical responsibilities associated with the assessment are explained to the student and other relevant parties. So that's just safety requirements associated with the task to make sure it is performed safely. We speak about safety in another clip. The need for any additional evidence gathering needed is identified and the student is informed. So it needs to be clear what you need to do. If you need to upload documents, that needs to be clearly explained. In relation to what form the document needs to be uploaded in, that also needs to be explained. So we'll look again at that a bit more with the learning management system. I mentioned earlier in the video that this is one of the most important parts of your job. The reason is if they don't do the assessments properly, we're potentially non-compliant because they're not putting forward all the evidence that's required. But also from your point of view, if you don't explain assessment tasks properly and prepare them properly, and the students will just make a mess of it, then you'll have to chase them back and forth before they're eventually compliant or competent. So to make your job easier, it's best to really go through the assessment task clearly with the student. Over time, this is one of the areas that we're working on hardest because we get feedback from students and teachers saying that often assessment tasks are unclear and they're not sure on what's required. So I'm going to go through an assessment task here, which I think covers off on lots of the things we're doing with our assessment tasks. So if you have a look, the assessment task has got an explanation of what's required. Now, some key points are it lists the resources and equipment required. So that's covered in another video, but this lets you know what you're going to need to have to achieve this task, what equipment. Now, with the task requirements, it's very important you go through this with your class and explain it. But you need to go through it before the class to make sure you're really clear on it. And if you're unclear on anything, speak to your academic coordinator about it. But if we have a look at this, for example, you're required to demonstrate skills in developing programs. To do this, you need to develop a basic program for a client you assess for screening and induction and for yourself based on the findings of an appraisal completed on you. So this is an example where it's spelling out that you need to do two different programs. There's been situations in the past where only one program has been uploaded because the trainer and assessor hasn't looked at it clearly and the instructions haven't been passed on to the students correctly. Generally then in an assessment task, it'll break it down further as to what you need to make sure you include in the program. So in this case, we've got a number of dot points of what your program needs to cover off. So as we work down further, it's split into two sections. You will need to ensure, and your program must include the following: warm up, etc. So very important you work through this with your students. So in a lot of cases now, we will provide you with a template where we feel it's appropriate. So in this case, at the bottom of the LMS, you'll see a template. Students click on it, and that gives a blank program template which they need to populate. This creates consistency amongst our different trainers and our different courses across the different academies. We've also included videos now. This is again to provide more clarity of what the assessment tasks are about. So you can have a look at these videos. They're for the purpose of both the trainers and the students. So basically you click on the video and it provides an explanation of what's required in the assessment task. This task is assessment task 1, which is a project and comes from the plan and deliver exercise cluster. The units covered in this assessment task are SIS FIT 002, recognise and apply exercise considerations for specific populations, and SIS FIT 004, incorporate anatomy and physiology principles into fitness programming. The goal of this task is So we won't show any more of that, but basically the video goes through the assessment tasks, what's required, common questions, what has to be uploaded, and so on. Another important thing to look at in preparing the student is make them aware at the bottom of each page there's a rubric. So this is basically the key things that the trainer and assessor is going to be looking for. So the student then knows these are as well as the dot points up here, these are the key things that my trainer or assessor is going to be looking for when they assess this assessment task. So as mentioned earlier, it's really important that you spend a fair bit of time going through the assessment task so that everyone in the class is really clear of what's required. I guess this is one of the major motivations for putting videos together, which we'll be completing for all courses across 2018. Because often in a class, you might explain something, but the student forgets. By having the video there, they can watch the video 2 or 3 times if they're not really sure on what is required for the assessment task. But as a trainer and assessor, make sure that if you're unclear, you go and speak to your academic coordinator. Rather than pushing ahead with the assessment task and doing something wrong, speak to the academic coordinator. Also, make sure you look through the assessor guide for any tips on completing the assessment task and the way you need to explain it to students, because the assessor guide will have more information in it in most cases than what the student's assessment task will.